Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Dr. Sarah Lipson, an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Law, Policy, and Management at Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Lipson has been the principal investigator of the Healthy Minds Network for over 10 years. I'm going to say that again. Dr. Lipson has been the principal investigator of the Healthy Minds Network for over 10 years, one of the nation's premier research organizations contributing to adolescent and youth mental health. Her research focuses on addressing mental health inequalities within college universities and improving safety and practices at Boston University. Specifically, Dr. Lipson received her PhD in public health and education from the University of Michigan and hopes to understand mental health in college populations. Dr. Lipson, thank you so much for joining me today on Hopeful Conversations.
Thanks so much, Kari. Looking forward to chatting.
Can you give us a little bit of background for our listeners to understand maybe what the Healthy Minds Network and the Healthy Minds Study are?
Yeah, for sure. The Healthy Minds Network is a research to practice organization or initiative. Our starting point is with research. So that's really where our expertise lies and what our starting point is for our work. So the Healthy Minds Study is our main research initiative. It's an annual online survey of college students and their mental health, their help-seeking behaviors, and a range of other topics. And we now have as well as survey of faculty and staff at colleges and universities. So we collect data every year through the Healthy Minds Study across the country. And then with the Healthy Minds Network, our broader initiative, it's trying to take that data that we collect and go a little bit further with it, put it in the hands of policymakers and practitioners in a way that can actually inform their work. So really, again, trying to use our data and research expertise to make the data as useful as possible to individual schools that are using the data, as well as states that are making decisions about, mental health policies. There's a whole range of stakeholders that we aim to deliver the data to, and we have a lot of different mechanisms to support that goal. But it's really around collecting this large-scale data and then making it as useful as possible.
And it is large scale. There's a lot of young people that participate.
Yes, we've done the Healthy Minds Study it'll be close to 800 colleges and universities after this academic year fully wraps up, and close to 800,000 student participants over time. So it's going to be exciting. At some point in the next couple of years, we're going to reach that million participant mark, which will be really exciting. But it's a very large scale initiative every year.
Thank you for sharing. I think that background gives good context. Um, Studies show that while there has been an increase in college students receiving mental health assistance, adversely, there has been an increase in college students struggling with their own mental health. From your professional understanding, how would you justify this trend in students' mental health?
Yes, so that is accurate. We've seen in our Healthy Minds data both an increase in help-seeking behavior, students accessing mental health services, and we've also seen an increase in prevalence. But the increase in prevalence has far outpaced the increase in treatment. So the unmet need has just continued to grow, even though we have seen significant increases in students' utilization of services, which is really a good thing in a lot of ways. There are fewer barriers. We've seen stigma really going down over the last 10 years in our data. We've seen that students are pretty knowledgeable about the resources that are available to them. And it's simply a kind of a supply demand imbalance when we think about the rising prevalence levels and the clinical services that are there to support this growing number of students. And that's why our team is really focused on thinking about population level approaches. So we really try to think about what are the ways that we can kind of be as efficient and effective as possible in delivering services to students. And that's not always, just one-on-one counseling or therapy. That's one of the more kind of resource intensive options, and absolutely is the right option for some students, but not for all. And so
Mm-hmm.
trying to think about how we can continue to increase help seeking to meet this rising demand. And if
Mm-hmm.
it's helpful, I can put some numbers behind it. We've seen about a 26% increase in help seeking behavior over the last 10 years. But we
26%.
26%, but we've seen about 135% increase in symptoms of depression, about 110% increase in symptoms of anxiety.
Wow. Those are really high numbers. 135% increase in depression and 110% in anxiety.
And that's based
That-
on symptom levels. So not diagnosis, but actual like screenings and the results from population level screens.
hmm. If you the call, so in adult populations, they say that the average person waits to seek medical care for diagnosable anxiety or depression. Like I've heard 6 to 10 years. Is that applicable to college students, or is there a number?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the most motivating factors behind our work and behind underscoring the importance of higher education as a setting is when we think about what you just said with the treatment delay and then also the age of onset. So about 75% of lifetime mental health problems will onset by around age 25. And most disorders that emerge after that age tend to be comorbid, so existing alongside another mental health problem that someone's experiencing. So if we isolate, that high school into college age, for many folks, that is, a time when these problems first onset. So it's that much more important to try to connect folks to resources that can be helpful for them during that time. To try to reduce that delay. It also becomes more difficult in a lot of scenarios to treat mental health problems the longer they go on untreated. Certainly, thinking about eating disorders as an example, the longer that those problems go on, the more we would say refractory to treatment or difficult to treat these problems become, and they're more likely, of course, to become comorbid or for maladaptive coping mechanisms like substance use to come into the picture. So it's, yes, that trying to reduce that treatment delay during this very epidemiologically vulnerable time for the onset of mental health problems. That's really kind of the motivating factor behind why this age group is so important.
So important. How do you think the accessibility for mental health resources has evolved over the last 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one I would be interested in hearing a lot of different perspectives on, like including students who are kind of on the ground. But yeah, so how the delivery of mental health services or access to mental health services has changed over the last 10 years. So I mentioned, stigma has continued to go down. So there's, most students actually report that they have pretty positive attitudes about mental health treatment, that they think it's effective. They're aware of the resources that are available to them. So some of these more kind of traditional barriers that we think about in terms of access to care actually are not as much of a factor with college students. There are still financial barriers for sure. And I'm mainly talking about being able to access any mental health services. There are issues with kind of continuity of care and like long-term care that some schools just aren't set up to deliver. But overall, there are fewer barriers in higher education for students accessing mental health services. Certainly, there has been some expansion of sort of the menu of resources for mental health for students. That it used to be, you're experiencing something related to your mental health, there's one place to go. If you're lucky to be on a campus that has a counseling center, that's where you go. Done and done. That's, that was quite a while ago. We've certainly moved past that, and as I said, the menu of options has expanded, and there's a lot of wellness initiatives, there's screening initiatives, there's gatekeeper training programs that are educational for population. So there's a lot of mental health programming and resources beyond just the one-on-one counseling and therapy. There's also, of course, been to varying levels, an embracing of technology, either as a sole, means of connecting students to mental health resources, which can be particularly important. I'm thinking of an example where I know of a school that is really invested in having a digital mental health resource with different languages spoken.
Huh.
So for students for whom, going to seek mental health treatment, particularly if it's, one of your first times, just given the age of onset, and you're, in a new location, if you're in a new country, even,
That's some big
going to
barriers.
college, to then expect that someone could, articulately walk into a counseling center and, in their non-native language describe, complex emotions, is maybe just too much to ask of students, and maybe we need to be putting resources in front of them that actually more so meet their needs. So I'm thinking of an example of a school that invested in a digital mental health initiative where students can, speak their native languages when they're accessing mental health services, and how important that is. Other examples of kind of the expansion of digital mental health resources are, of course, telemental health therapy. Using digital resources sort of as an augmentation. So maybe you would have a student who otherwise would have, accessed one-on-one counseling or therapy every week, but maybe with, a self-guided CBT app or some other evidence-based digital intervention. Maybe those meetings could get spread out over time, and they, need not 100% of those in-person meetings. Maybe it can be reduced to 60%, and the digital can be kind of supplemented in between. So there's a lot going on there, and there's even more going on in terms of kind of prevention efforts and population level initiatives.
Ooh, I like the word prevention. What do you want to share with me there? That's what Robbie's Hope is all about. Um,
Well, yeah, there's so much, kind of thinking along this continuum. Oftentimes in public health, we'll think about sort of an ecological model, which looks like concentric circles, and there's an individual in the center and the smallest circle. And at the outer circle, the biggest circle, is sort of society, its policies, its systems, its structures. Between that are, the organization, the community, peers, all of that. But at the highest level are some of the most important opportunities for prevention. So thinking about systems and structures, I can give a few examples of kind of prevention at a system level. So some of the prevention efforts at a system level for mental health are things related to basic needs insecurity. So really trying to encourage schools to think about things like food pantries and their housing offerings as part of a comprehensive mental health program. Like, we need to be thinking about these initiatives and investments in terms of how they affect student well-being and students academically. Both, I think, addressing those basic needs affects both. And we can talk about the groups of students who are struggling with untreated mental health problems, so like they're not accessing services, and what that means for academics as well. So that's one example of system level, is basic needs. Another example at a system level is policies in campuses that could reduce discrimination. So we think about the growing number of trans and non-binary students, things like name change policies, having an easily accessible name change policy, one that really allows a student to say, this is my preferred name, these are my pronouns, and that goes to every faculty member, that goes into the health system. So students aren't going to be misgendered or dead named in classroom environments or in the health system as well. So that's another example at a system level of a kind of population level initiative. There are other prevention efforts that have been going on for a long time, but there's a lot of opportunity to improve the implementation of them. So we can take the example of gatekeeper training programs, which are typically these really, brief programs to train lay people, so non-mental health professionals, to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental health problems and to be able to make a referral. The way that yes, exactly. QPR is a great example. Mental health first aid. There's a number of commercial programs, and then a lot of schools have kind of started their own gatekeeper training programs. The way that they are typically implemented is to a targeted, selected group of people on campus, and oftentimes there's a lot of rational thinking behind who are we training. Okay, let's train our residence hall advisors, let's train, our athletic trainers, let's train, a select number of folks in, academic advising positions. But when we're talking about prevalence levels as high as 50% of students meeting criteria for one or more mental health conditions, we really
It's
can't
not enough
take
people.
this
Yeah.
targeted approach. So the
Right.
implementation change that I encourage schools to take is to really move towards saturation approach, meaning that every single student, faculty, and staff member is trained in these gatekeeper training skills. It's also not enough to just do this training as a one-off and expect that people, months later, when they're, in a situation to utilize these skills, that they're fresh on their mind. So we need to have, to use language of the pandemic, things that we're kind of familiar with as public health best practices. We need boosters. We need to refresh people's knowledge and understanding, and really we need also for there to be opportunities for folks to practice their skills in as being interventionists. So yeah, that's kind of there. I could say a lot about the various prevention efforts, but those are some of them.
That's exactly where my mind went to when you started to talk about QPR and youth mental health first aid, is that it's not just a checkbox. And I like that, the booster, because when you actually have experience using it, I'm a certified QPR trainer and I'm a youth mental health first aid trainer. And I would say that I have probably done more training combining the two and combining our Robbie's Hope Adult Handbook and making it just applicable to the audience that I'm speaking to. But it's not a checkbox. It's not a one and done. This is a
Right.
continuing conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there some schools that are making bigger strides than others in services that they're offering, or like best practices? Like I'm sure there's a lot of inequities in schools reaching their students and being successful.
Yes. We can get back to the best practices question, because that's like a
Okay.
bigger question in the field.
Sure.
And there's no like one size fits all approach, of course. Um, yes, I mean, absolutely. Like there's, schools that have invested enormously in supporting student mental health, and I don't just mean financial investments. There are schools with minimal resources that have done really innovative, important work, including some of these things I'm talking about at a prevention level, like inclusivity around policies. um, the organization Active Minds, which is a national mental health advocacy organization, they award every year the Healthy Campus Award to 5 campuses who have really prioritized student health and well-being. And they share kind of the best practices from those 5 schools. Like, what have these schools done? What are the initiatives that they've prioritized? How have they implemented these? And they have a webinar where we get to hear from all of the schools. So, and they've been doing that for, gosh, probably going on like 8 years or so of the Healthy Campus Award. So there's, something like 40 schools that have received this award, and it's a range from, public four-year schools, community colleges, liberal arts colleges. It really runs the diversity of institutions in higher education. So yes, there are schools that have been like formally acknowledged as doing really well with this. There are also schools that have that are really at the forefront of these conversations around mental health because they need to be, even more so than some other institutions. So schools that serve a population that just has a higher prevalence or higher like risk factors. Um, so I feel that's a little bit of like, tiptoeing around the answer. I'm not naming like specific schools necessarily. One, because I don't feel like I have the full like national purview of what every single school is doing. So I would refer folks to the Healthy Campus Award from Active Minds if you want to see the schools that have kind of been awarded that award and kind of what they've done.
It's probably a good idea for a prospective student to,
Yeah.
to look at this part of a campus that they're looking at. Like what is offered and try to get a pulse from other students that are attending. Like what's the conversation like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think that students are doing that more and more. There's also ways that prospective students can look and see what are the, broader campus policies at my institution. There's an organization called the Campus Pride Index that tracks LGBTQ policies in higher ed. And so prospective students can search by school and see like what do the policies look like at the school? Is this a place that at a system level is protecting LGBTQ students?
Yeah. So that kind of leads really nicely into particular groups of college students that appear to be more vulnerable to mental health challenges. I think you've named a few of them. Can you fill us in from your experience and your expertise on which populations are more at risk?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to kind of preface talking about the groups that are at higher risk by saying like this is not like a biological predisposition among in this group. This is related to risk factors at many different levels that leave certain folks more vulnerable to mental health struggles. um, so in Healthy Minds, we sort of look at two buckets of outcomes. One is related to prevalence, and then the other is related to help seeking. With regard to prevalence, we see the largest inequalities are among LGBTQ students as well as low income students. Those groups have significantly higher prevalence in terms of symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidality. In particular, trans and non-binary students have much higher rates of reported suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. In the
Is it like
second
twice?
bucket, what was that?
Is it twice? Is it two times
It's
generally?
even it's even more than that. It's more like it depends exactly the measure that we're looking at, but it's more like four times the rate.
Wow. Wow.
Trans and non-binary students represent about 3% of the overall student sample from Healthy Minds, and they account for about 15% of students who report attempting suicide in the past year.
Huh.
So and LGBTQ students as well have higher prevalence rates. I've been doing a lot of work around suicidality among trans and non-binary students, so those numbers are fresh in my mind. But in our data overall, LGBTQ students have higher prevalence, and low-income students also have higher prevalence rates. Then, when we look at the second bucket of outcomes related to utilization of services and help seeking behavior, it's students of color and first generation college students who are much less likely to access services, controlling for symptom levels. So, accounting for the severity of symptoms, students of color and first generation college students much less likely to seek help.
Huh. So interesting. Those system changes, like how can you be healthy in your mind when you're worrying about paying for everything, affording everything, worried about your family at home, that you're taking this time to further your education, but you could be working and probably giving money to home. There's just, it's so many complex layers.
Absolutely. Student debt has, continued to increase and is a very, very powerful predictor of mental health in this population as well.
What about just like academic pressure or social media pressure? How do we look at those factors?
Yeah, so I said earlier that the connection between mental health and academics, it's bidirectional. So we know that mental health affects academic performance, and we know that students' experiences in the classroom also and their learning also affect their mental health. Um, what we have seen in longitudinal research with Healthy Minds data following the same students over time is that untreated depression is associated with a twofold increase in the likelihood of stopping out or dropping out of college without graduating. And the same students who are the least likely to access mental health services when they're struggling, again, first generation and students of color, are the same students on average who have the lowest rates of persistence and retention in higher education. And like I just said, there is this very powerful relationship between untreated mental health problems and low persistence and retention. So there's an enormous opportunity to invest in supporting the well-being of students of color and first generation students. I'd say there's several folks on our team, and including one of my co-principal investigators, Daniel Eisenberg, is an economist, and so he frames these questions around, why is it important to make these investments, and what is the return that schools can expect? And there's an enormous return on investment, both for relieving, student suffering, for reducing inequalities, and then for helping out schools' bottom lines. I mean, for tuition-driven institutions, they're very motivated to retain their students and help them persist to graduation.
Huh. ROI in the field of mental health and higher ed.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's one of our most widely used tools is the return on investment calculator that we created, and it allows schools to put in, your student body size. Mostly, a lot of the schools have participated in Healthy Minds, so they can, plug in their data gets plugged in there. But if they don't have Healthy Minds data, they can plug in another source of data, and then it will tell you, if you were to invest X number of dollars, here's what you would expect in terms of tuition retained. And it's always a strong return on investment. And it's particularly important thinking about these investments from an equity perspective.
If it drives the change, that's fantastic. Like
Yeah, yeah.
looking at it from a business model. Do you want to talk about Dr. Lipson? Talk about Boston University. Our family has a special connection to BU. Our daughter graduated in 2021 from Boston University, but
Yeah, yeah. I certainly can talk about BU. From the Healthy Minds perspective, I somewhat kind of keep that national hat on and know, kind of what's going on with colleges and universities across the country, and know a little bit more, of course, because I'm at BU, but it's, the laboratory for our research is really national as opposed to just being at
sure,
BU.
sure.
I can say that something that was really important to me as I was thinking about, my next steps in my career and where I wanted to end up. BU had already been participating in Healthy Minds and prioritizing the collection of data from students for many years before I, even had an opportunity to come and talk at BU. So this is already an institution that cared about collecting student mental health data, that was using it to inform programs and policies already. I think like many schools, there has been, continued investment in staffing, not only clinical staffing, but also sort of elevating leaders in mental health on campus to higher roles beyond just being in the health system. So I think we've expanded the kind of workforce within BU, and also elevated certain folks to have more kind of prominent positions given the importance of mental health on our campus. Most of the other things I would say about BU are just, how happy I am at the institution as a whole, but I don't think it really necessarily directly pertains to the broader conversation about mental health. I can say that just one initiative that I started at BU that I think folks are often interested in, and it's one that folks could, I know, for high school students or college students or parents, but also, if any faculty are listening or administrators, it's an initiative that I borrowed and kind of adapted from Harvard. It's called Reflections on Rejections, and it's a compilation of written reflections about folks' experiences with rejections, failures, and setbacks in academia. I think it's very easy for students to look at particularly faculty members and think, this person has just had all success. There's been nothing but success for this person standing up at the front of the room. They are so accomplished. I mean, I remember feeling that way.
Sure.
And so what I'm trying to do with Reflections on Rejections is sort of normalize the fact that the people that you might think are sort of flawless, perfect academic scholars have had far more failures, setbacks, and rejections than we have acceptances and awards and accomplishments. And that's never talked about. There's just such asymmetric information, online and just what we see. So I really am trying to kind of normalize that at BU, and that's gained a lot of traction. And there's been a lot of support, like from leaders within my school, that I think speaks to how valued mental health and well-being is, that the leaders of our school would take time to be vulnerable, to share their own experiences with rejection. What was the other part? You can cut this. What was the other
No,
part?
that's great. That's great.
You had just asked
I
about one other thing, though.
I got excited about rejections because I feel like that has just tons of power from um, kids and listening to them. And like when you
Yeah,
take the opportunity to be vulnerable and be real, like suddenly their interest in you grows and they're probably more respectful of you because you're human and you're not
yeah.
perfect and you're willing to just peel back that layer.
Absolutely. And I hope it makes students feel more comfortable, when they are experiencing some sort of setback to come. And that's part of the motivation for me is, I think I really, especially in graduate school, was very much kind of this perfectionist mindset and had a lot of successes. And then when I had a failure or a setback, I kind of kept it to myself. I didn't really feel like I could tell my advisor. I didn't want to disappoint anyone, and realizing, no, like your advisor already got a rejection one time today and probably one tomorrow and one the next week, because the more things you're involved in, the more there's going to be those rejections. It's just such a normal part of academic life, which doesn't make it any easier, but it certainly is harder if you keep it to yourself and you can't talk about it. So I hope that it's sort of opening up those conversations and normalizing this.
Very helpful information. I want to make a little bit of a shift and just get your insight on what you think college students can bring to the table in this discussion and potential, taking steps forward on campus for themselves and for their fellow students for mental health challenges.
Yes, there's so much that students themselves can do, and so much power that students have. So I mentioned the organization Active Minds. That's a great place for students to look, whether you're at an institution that formally has an Active Minds chapter or not. There are toolkits. There's so much around advocating for mental health on campus. There's just so many resources that Active Minds has put out that are open to students. So that's sort of the first stop that I would encourage. Then going back to this sort of ecological model of thinking about these different levels of influence, students have a lot of a very important voice in terms of policy change. So something that I say when I talk to student audiences is, and again, I said, I've been doing a lot of research recently around trans and non-binary students, and that's a minority population on this campus, on any campus. And so for change to happen, it cannot come from just the 3 to 4% of students on campus who identify as trans or non-binary saying, we need these policies to be inclusive of us. If these policies are changing, it will reduce the discrimination that we face. Same with, policies that are negatively affecting students of color. Like to just have the responsibility fall to people within that identity group is a huge missed opportunity. So my biggest advice is to kind of think about opportunities for allyship, and to think about, so I would encourage every student to go and look and see, what are the policies on your campus right now? Do you agree with them? Do you think that they're maybe, creating some inequalities on your campus? You have the potential to change that. And I don't say that to say it, it's easy, and it's much easier said than done, but there's a lot of resources for advocating for policy change for students as well. Students are the most likely, particularly when they're in a crisis, to go to another peer. I'm sure you know this, and you've talked about this. So again, it's really important for every single student to have some basic training in mental health. And if that's not already happening at your school, I would encourage students to advocate for that, to demand that, to say, depending on what source of data you have at your school around the mental health prevalence, or maybe you just want to, nationally cite Healthy Minds data of, between 40 and 50% of students in our data are screening positive for depression, anxiety, and or suicidal ideation. And we need to have peers who are the ones that folks are turning to. You're turning to your peers when you're in distress, and to demand that you receive that type of training, that all students receive that type of training, and that you receive it on an ongoing basis. Of course, there's a huge place for just kindness and valuing community. One kind of protective factor, I think I've mentioned a number of risk factors, but one really key protective factor is sense of belonging. And I mentioned I do survey research, so I'm thinking about specific like survey measures related to sense of belonging. But just in general, if students feel like they belong on their campus, that is a positive predictor of their mental health, of persistence and retention. It's actually getting back to the return on investment. It's a positive predictor of future giving by alumni. And so sometimes I'll talk to schools and they'll say, what levers do we have to do are in our purview that we can pull that will directly affect student mental health? And I think I want to answer that question of what can directly affect student mental health, but there's also a really big pathway through sense of belonging. There's a lot of initiatives to try to foster that sense of belonging using peers, using students to build that community that can then kind of indirectly affect student mental health. And then we've been talking about these concentric circles. Like at the center is students embedded within smaller communities of individuals who are close friends, and so that's where I think self-care, the more kind of intuitive, like mindfulness based approaches are just that those are things that are in your control. And that's a thing that is much easier said than done. But I think if schools are prioritizing that mindfulness based education, particularly, I wish I'd had that at the age of 18, starting college in a new environment, to know how to sit with uncomfortable feelings, and to know how to have breathing exercises, to recognize when my stress levels were changing, all of these things that are part of mindfulness, knowing how to slow your brain down and be present. It's on individual students. If that's being offered to them, it's on them to actually utilize those resources. So my kind of pitch for that is just that mental health is going to be important for any goal or priority that a student has during college, whether they're a student athlete and they're focused on balancing athletics and academics. Prioritizing your mental health is going to benefit both of those things. If you're a student who has really big ambitious academic goals for yourself, prioritizing your mental health, even though it might feel like you're taking time away from this priority of your academics, it is very likely, especially if you're doing some things that are really good for you as an individual, that is likely to benefit you academically as well.
Student return on investment.
Yes, absolutely.
Find your people. I talk to high school kids all the time that are nervous about going to college, and it's just like, oh, if you can find your people, find your community in that bigger community, the success you're potentially going to have and the happiness that you're going to have is just probably going to be much higher. It's harder to do things alone. The mindfulness education, that's so interesting. I feel like in high school, it's still, we're kind of going backwards as a country, providing those opportunities to kids, health ed and mindfulness. There's a lot of emphasis on middle schoolers and elementary schools, but most of our high school kids have not had those offerings. I do feel like kids are learning it on their own because they see that it's important, but more
Yeah.
opportunity there, I think.
Yeah, and you said your you said your daughter, right, had graduated. You said your daughter had graduated from BU in 2021. That's years of her college experience that were, really changed and drastically changed by the pandemic. And so now we're kind of coming back and coming out of that. And so I'm hopeful that there's even more opportunities. I felt a little bit like I, just had nothing to say about what do you do around like isolation and loneliness for college students during that time. There were things that we could do, and we were suggesting them, but it's really, really hard to find your people and to find your community, even under the best circumstances as well. It's and then adding in The pandemic, I think, for a lot of people, made that almost impossible to find your community. So I know that it's not always easy to find your people and to find your community. It's not just in peers. There's a lot of research to also say that just having a single faculty or staff member on a campus who knows your name, who you can have a one-on-one conversation with, that's another huge protective factor. We didn't really talk about the implications for faculty and staff, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that faculty and staff can be thinking about that can really support students. And if we're working in higher education, we care about students. We want to interact with students, and there's a lot of ways we can do that and be really impactful for student well-being.
Such good advice. I was just recently talking to a college sophomore, and she's like, at the beginning of every semester, I go in and I go to those office hours and I introduce myself. And she's like, I think that's like the best step that I can take for my mental health. And she goes, and then I always ask them just a little bit about themselves, like something a little bit deeper. Like, it's like very wise.
Yes.
Fun. Well, we always end every single podcast with the same question, Dr. Lipson. So this is your chance to answer. And you can answer this in any way that you see right. But what does the world need to hear right now?
Ooh, what does the world need to hear right now? Gosh, that's a good one. Typical me, I'll try to make it like more specific to help myself have some like boundaries on this, and I'll think about maybe like what students might want to hear right now. Which is like, we're going into summer, right? So it's finals right now in May, and we're coming into graduation. So I know that's a really vulnerable time for a lot of students. It's a really exciting time as well. So yeah, to take a break, to actually like give yourself a chance. If you're in an academic setting where the summer is a time when you're not teaching or taking classes, to actually treat it as a break, whatever that means for you. I think we all need a break. Yeah, I think
I
that's
think that's
my
good.
advice, is to take that break. There's a lot of things that the world um, really needs to hear right now, but and a lot of people, I think, who feel rightly so very unsafe, and that their identities are not um, allowed, or make them unsafe, and a lot of course basic needs that are being stripped from people. So there's certainly big broader messages there, and I know that also contributes to the kind of exhaustion and burnout that so many people are feeling when they're trying to make change in this world. So I think it's just very important to, particularly for young people who are such extraordinary advocates, to take some time off. You will be better advocates throughout your entire lives if you do take some time to rest and recover and prioritize yourself.
Thank you. Dr. Lipson, thank you so much for joining me today on a hopeful conversation. To our listeners, be sure to tune into our next episode. And until then, remember, hold on, pain ends.